Again, welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Laura Maher, and I am Chief of Staff and Director of External Engagement here at Siegel Family Endowment. We are so glad you're here because today we are launching our white paper on inquiry-driven philanthropy, which we define as an approach to grant making that centers questions. So we've been building and testing this framework for the past decade, and we finally codified it into what we've learned into a comprehensive theory and guide that we hope will be very useful for the sector. So we're going to dive into that over the next hour, but first, a few quick housekeeping items. So one, the session is being recorded and it'll be available on our website and shared with all registrants afterwards. Number two is the chat is open, so please introduce yourself, your name, your organization, your location, and if you are so inclined, a burning question that you've been wrestling with. And then finally, we won't be able to get to every question live, but we're capturing everything in the chat and we'll follow up where we can. So today's agenda. Here's how the next hour is going to go. So first, we're going to have some welcome remarks by Katie Knight, our President and Executive Director. She will set the stage for why this work matters now. Then we'll hear from Stefan Verhulst from the GovLab, who will provide an overview on the science of questions, which is our theoretical foundation for this approach. I'll take it from there and introduce how we've applied that science of questions to our philanthropy here at Siegel. And then I'll pass it over to Kyla Kasharian and Amanda Ahern, who co-lead our knowledge and impact team. They're going to take you under the hood and show you what this has looked like for us in practice. And then finally, we're going to close with the Q&A, addressing many of the questions that you sent into your registration and maybe some live ones as well if we can get to them. So with that, I am delighted to turn it over to Katie Knight, our President and CEO, who is unfortunately had a little bit of transportation delays, so is calling in via audio. But Katie.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. I'm sorry, friends, that you don't get to see my airport outfit, but the one in this picture is better, so I'll leave it there. I am joining in transit because I cannot overstate how important this notion of inquiry-driven philanthropy is to our organization, but also to me personally, to be quite honest. January will mark 10 years since I formally joined Siegel Family Endowment, initially joining to oversee our grant making and ultimately now overseeing the whole operation for better, of course. And from the start, I knew that we had an incredible opportunity because of our chairman's openness and desire to do something more than just a traditional sort of blueprint foundation, to think about all of the places where we hoped philanthropy might be or do better and aim to make something happen. And so inquiry driven philanthropy was born out of a sense that so much of what we do and what we learn ultimately falls by the wayside through the cracks of Google Docs or Microsoft Office docs, if you're still on those, and really doesn't live in the sort of dynamic conversational space where we're able to interrogate our wins, but also our failures and think together about how we might do more, do better, do different work than what we've done in the past. I was struck in those early days by how philanthropy still felt so siloed and so much like what we were learning was just what we were learning. And that field learnings were often things that were being dictated to us by researchers or practitioners, but far too rarely by ourselves from our own learnings. I think there was a fear and a notion that to share about failure was somehow the opposite of the intention, that we should talk about scaling our successes, pitch each other on exciting opportunities, but not really discuss how something went wrong or maybe needed to be changed midstream so that we could actually achieve something better. So I challenged the team to consider what we might do if instead of setting success or failure conditions based on whether what we thought would happen happened, we just set success or failure around how much we were able to learn. That we support good work was already a given. I know philanthropies across the country and around the world are all supporting incredibly good work. So rather than continue to try to think about whether it was good or not so great or just good enough, could we think about how we could get better together if we shared our failures, developed new questions to interrogate based on those experiences, and then tried to push the field forward, not just from the outside, but from the inside. And I'm really, really proud over the last decade of what our team has accomplished, not only in tackling the challenge of having a real learning stance when it comes to our philanthropy, but codifying it, making it meaningful for our grantees and partners as well, and ultimately sharing it back to the field, which is what this white paper is the culmination of, but what we've been doing along the way, because the process of inquiry driven philanthropy is also iterative and inquiry driven in and of itself. Do I think we have everything settled and perfect? Absolutely not. Do I think there's immense value in thinking about philanthropy's role, not just as risk capital and as an innovator and as a potential laboratory for the solutions that can help drive the issues we care about forward, but as a space where we question, rethink, adapt, interrogate again and again so that what we are doing stands the test of time, not just because our name is on the building or because we can say, hey, we served 10,000, 100,000, a million people, but because those learnings are in the hands of our peers who will operationalize them, will take them forward, and who will continue to build on them even if we are no longer doing it ourselves. So I'm grateful that you all are curious to hear anything about this and look forward to sharing with you our continued journey in this process. Thank you again, and I'll pass it back to Laura to get us started.
Great, and safe travels. Well, thank you so much, Katie. I am going to now kick it over to Stefan for a deeper look into the new science of questions. Stefan, take it away.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Laura, and thanks, Katie, for setting the stage here. And congratulations to the Siegel team for launching the white paper, inquiry-based philanthropy. And my role today is mainly to provide a more helicopter kind of perspective on why we need a new science of questions. Next slide. And I will not specifically unlock what the new science of questions looks like, but I will try to be more provocative because otherwise, anyway, why join a webinar if you don't have some provocations to at least stay on and then learn from Laura, Kyla, and the Siegel team how Siegel has actually advanced this new science of questions as it relates to philanthropy. And my first provocation is going to be that we are in today's world data and answer rich, but in many ways also question poor. And this is my famous equation because many of you might be data scientists and always eager to at least have some equation to think about. And so my equation to start off is that we actually as a society have optimized for answers, but have neglected the questions that ultimately provide the value of the answer. Because the value of the answer, the value of data depends directly on the value of the question and whether that question actually matters and whether that question is one that we should pay attention to make progress as it relates to societal challenges. Next slide. And so just to take us back a little bit is that from my perspective, as it relates to inquiry, but also as it relates to inquiry within the context of philanthropy, we are actually experiencing a massive system failure. On the one hand, we have exponential growth in data, not always accessible, but still massive generation of new data sources. We also have a massive increase of publications that are either open or less accessible, but at least we have an increase in actually insight and in answers. At the same time, what we see is actually a slowing rate of transformative insight. We have no shortage of publications, but are these actually transformative? Are they really providing insight that we can act upon, insight that makes society much better? At the same time, we also see this misalignment between data outputs and actually societal needs. Next slide. And so given this societal and system failure, the question is then, of course, what can we do about it and how should we address it? And from my perspective, most of the solutions that have been provided in order to kind of deal with the systems failure, where we on the one hand have no shortage of data, but the other hand have actually a decrease in breakthrough insights, a lot of the solutions have been in kind of creating more data or in trying to come up with kind of innovative structures to create more publications, or to ultimately transform how we evaluate the output as well. But from my perspective, while these are valuable, they're all focused on downstream solutions, and they do not address how inquiry, how ultimately the value of data itself is being generated, and that's by focusing on questions. Next slide. And that is especially problematic when it comes to kind of data. And as many of you know, at GovLab, for the last decade or so, we've been focusing on how do we unlock data to address critical public needs, and how do we unlock data to improve philanthropy. But what we see is that quite often data science starts from the data that is available. And so we have quite often the lamppost phenomenon, where you seek for solutions where the lamp basically shines, but not where the keys might be. Next slide. This is even more problematic when it comes to AI. And so many of you know the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where at a certain point in time, an answer is being provided by the advanced machine, which is 42. Unfortunately, no one knows what is the answer to. What is 42? What does it mean? And so that's kind of what we see in today's environment as it relates to data science and as it relates to AI science, is that a lot of it is focused on the answer, on the insight, but not on what is actually the question that we should seek to answer. Next slide. And how do we then start formulating questions in ways that generate insight as well? And this is especially true when it comes to AI, because to a large extent, AI is kind of a solution machine, is kind of an answer machine. Any answer you seek to get, they will provide with some insight or some response, whether or not, of course, it is hallucinated or not. And so what we see is kind of this shift in cost, where in the past there was massive cost in actually obtaining an answer. And now, from my perspective, the cost is really in structuring the inquiry, is to really know what question comes first. And if we then have an answer, what's the next question? And some have called this the challenge of dealing with diagnostic uncertainty, knowing actually what question should be formulated in order to really provide then insight that matters, and then to have the next question that can be answered in ways that generate insight that can be actionable. Next slide. And so I'm not the only one that have been advocating for more science. We've seen this also in the kind of AI space, and this is kind of, I thought, was a great front page cover that we should acknowledge, where many have acknowledged that actually the right question is what really is missing right now, and that where most of the attention should lie, despite the fact that we're now kind of still obsessed with the answers and how we go about generating answers. Next slide. And again, as I said, this is meant to be more provocative. Of course, it's far more complicated than that. But at the same time, we can actually state that from an inquiry perspective, we have less of a productivity problem, but more of what I call a directionality problem. What is actually the question that we should seek to answer in order to steer us into a direction that we learn from, to steer us in a direction that we actually generate insight that we can act upon? Next slide. Or next point. Having said that, when we start looking at questions, we also have to start realizing that questions are not neutral. And that's where I think the whole issue of questions inequity comes into play as well, because who formulates the question ultimately sets the agenda. And the question then is, of course, who is typically part of formulating the question? Who is determining what we're going to pay attention to? And especially also quite often within the kind of research funding environment, who is determining what will get funded? What questions actually are worth examining? And so that means that we cannot just assume that questions can be approached by a new scientific approach. We also have to take into account the societal implications and the political economy of questions if we want to really advance how we go about questions as well. Next slide. And so that leads me to my second provocation, which is that now that we know that in today's world where data and AI is becoming far more advanced and far more prevalent, how do we actually then also taking questions more seriously? And from my perspective, we have data science, we have AI science, but we don't really have question science, which is kind of shocking to think about the fact that we are now driven by AI, but we don't really have a really good basis to understand what is a good question, how do we structure questions, and so on. Next slide. And this is especially problematic because questions are a very powerful device. And as I said, it's a powerful device that quite often is poorly understood and largely ignored from a scientific, from a practice perspective. Questions are not important for inquiry. They're also important for agenda setting, as already mentioned, but they're also important for even deliberation, for learning, and for mobilization as well. So how do we become more sophisticated when it comes to questions? And so that's what, next slide, we have been trying to understand whether there's actually already an existing science as it relates to questions. And there is no shortage of kind of efforts that have tried to reflect on questions. Next slides. And so these, if you're interested, these are kind of good starting points to reflect on what is the role of questions in society. And quite often they are from an epistemological point of view. Sometimes they are from a point of view of science. Sometimes they are more of a point of view on actually science as learning devices, questions as learning devices. But it suffices to say that all of these are, while very valuable, next slide, they don't really provide for a theory that covers the full questions life cycle. They don't really tell you in practice quite often how do you go about formulating a question that really can make an impact, a question that could generate a breakthrough insight. They also don't really give you insight on how to prioritize questions because it's not just about formulating questions, it's about which question do we start with, which leads us to the need to have more insight on how do you sequence question. Because the interesting thing about questions, from my perspective, is the first part of the term questions, which is the quest. How do you go about structuring the quest? And much of the literature that is out there, which we have scanned and which we have tried to digest into some practical insight, much of the literature skips many of those questions. And more importantly, they also don't take into account the political economy of questions. They don't reflect on how do you go about making sure that questions are inclusive. There's a lot of focus on data governance, but there's no focus on question governance, for instance. How do you make sure that the questions are actually equitable and that they really address what society needs as well? Next slide. And so we have been working together with Siegel on developing this new science of questions, and I can disclose more about that at the end. So I need to make sure that everyone stays on the call till the end now. But suffice to say is that this cannot just be a science of questions without also being participatory, because as I already mentioned, there are a lot of power asymmetries when it comes to formulating questions. And that's also what we have been focusing on. How do we develop a new science of questions that is both participatory, but also gives us, at the time of data and AI, a real understanding on how do we actually structure questions, how do we sequence questions in ways that generates breakthrough insights as well. And let me end this short introduction and provocation, next slide, by always referring to, of course, Albert Einstein, who basically advocated that if I were given 1 hour to save the planet, I would spend 55 minutes defining the questions and 5 minutes resolving it. And my argument in the 10 minutes that I have is that we actually, as a society, have turned it upside down, where most of the time we spend 5 minutes on kind of formulating the questions and then 55 minutes on answering, which is important, but I hope I made the point that we need to become far more serious about questioning. And that's where Kyla, Laura, and the Siegel team have spent a lot of time on how to become more serious as it relates to questioning within philanthropy. And over to you.
Thank you so much, Stefan. So, given that grounding, we would like to present on this call Better Questions, Better Insights, how philanthropy can harness the science of questions for deeper impact. So a little bit of context about our origin story. Next slide, if you want to see the cover. Is so when we first launched Siegel, none of us had come from philanthropy. But one of the things that we did have was a founder who had a PhD in science who spent his career leading technology companies. And so he was always asking, how does technology reshape society, which is where we take our mission from. And so from day one of our central questions was, how do we navigate this complexity that technology brings? And along the way, as Katie said, we searched for tools and methodologies that we could do this in an adaptive and iterative way. So we needed an approach that was built for uncertainty. And so for the past 10 years, we've approached grant making much like scientists would approach research. We asked questions, developed hypotheses and learning agendas with our partners. We adapted and iterated based on what we found. And again, we didn't do this because we thought it was the only way or even the best way, but because we didn't have the answers. And so, why write it down now? So after a decade, we realized this, how we work sort of has turned into a systematic approach. We had partners telling us, this is different, you should be sharing this. We had some peers ask, like, how do you actually do this? Like, what are the frameworks? What does it actually look like to make this a grants orientation and not just a fun idea? And so this paper is us codifying it. Again, not as the only or the best way, but as one tested approach that has provided a lot of value for us. So what you're going to find in this white paper is like what has worked brilliantly for us, what has not worked, and we are actively documenting both. And then we also have some practical tools for those that are interested, things you can do tomorrow, next quarter, next year. Just it all depends on what makes sense for your grant making context. So, let's start with just how we define this approach. So, inquiry-driven philanthropy is an approach to grant making based on an iterative process of asking questions, systematically interrogating them, and applying the findings to subsequent rounds of questions. Great. What does this actually look like in practice? All right, so first, before I jump into the slide, just wanted to give a couple of caveats at the top. This is an overly simplified and somewhat reductive contrast. Not every, grant making approach looks like the archetype on top. If you've met one foundation, you've met one foundation, as the saying goes. But we've just seen this pattern enough across the sector that it's worth naming for us. So on top, we have sort of, a funder identifies a problem, sometimes solo, sometimes with input. Nonprofits in the field propose solutions, often with some predetermined deliverables that they hope to achieve. And even with general operating support, there's still this expectation of like, tell us what you're going to accomplish. And then we've also found, we've done this as well, like the reporting focuses on, did you do what you're going to say what you're going to do? And again, we've heard over and over and have experienced that this structuring the relationship the way has felt somewhat transactional, sort of like, we fund, you deliver. Where we've tried to, again, like reorient, not reinvent the wheel because many of the mechanics are the same, but it's like we start with a shared question that neither party, neither the funder nor the nonprofit or social purpose organization can answer alone. So we become co-investigators in our questions together. And this sort of makes the relationship a little bit more collaborative. So we're both learning, we're both allowed to have breakthroughs, we're both allowed to be wrong, which goes back to something Katie said at the top. There's no failure, there's just all like learning together. And the reporting here then focuses more on, what surprised us? How is our thinking evolved? Like, what are we learning about that changes our approach? And I think there's a couple of like key differences here around both the assumptions and the learning. So, one assumes that sort of we know the solution and we just need to figure out how to execute it. And like that works for many problems. But again, given our orientation around, thinking about how are we navigating this really complex technology as a society, which is many of the problems popping up today, like that, we don't actually know a lot of the solutions. So that orientation wasn't working for us. Whereas the inquiry approach assumes that the answers are going to emerge from some co-investigations as long as we're asking the right questions with our partners. And again, we found this has been a great approach for us in solving these like complex systemic problems that rarely have solutions. I think another thing too is like the people closest to the problem often have insights that we miss. And so when we create this questioning, which allows space for surprise, we get some of those breakthrough insights that we just couldn't have planned for. The next slide is just a graphic overview of the grant making cycle, if this is a little bit easier to see. You'll recognize many of these elements, and we'll cover them a lot more in depth in the next section. But just before we do that, I just wanted to dive into what shifts here. And then we're also going to do just a couple of examples after this. So stay with us. So which shifts here? Again, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel, but we found that this model reorients it a little bit. So it's from solutions to questions, from execution to learning, from assessing past performance to assessing the quality of learning. Like this is still very rigorous. It's just rigorous about different things. We're rigorous about question quality. We're rigorous about, is our thinking evolving? We're rigorous about, what are we discovering? So what stays the same? So on the right side, the core mechanics aren't changing. We're still setting agendas. We're still allocating funding. We're still building relationships. We're still assessing our progress. And we're building on what already works. So we've taken a lot of inspiration from both the scientific method and the community that our chairman comes from, as well as from other movements in philanthropy, trust-based philanthropy, participatory grant making, community-driven practices. Many of these things that have proven valuable both for funders and grantees alike across the sector. I think the other thing is that the curiosity that many of us have and so many of our closest peers in the space feel does not change. What we're just trying to do is apply rigor to curiosity. We're trying to say we don't have to choose between rigor and curiosity. Like inquiry-driven grant making tries to bring discipline to the idea of like being of exploration and being open and changing, basically putting a framework around something we already do intuitively. And then finally, I can't drive this point home enough, which is that this is meant to expand philanthropy's repertoire, not replace what is known to work. So this is high level overview. So what has inquiry unlocked for us? All right, so here's a few questions that we've asked in the past and how we reframe them. I might just give everyone a beat to read so it's not me talking over them. And I think the pattern that I wanted to call out here is that I think initially the first question in each pair is more oriented around solutions. It sort of assumes we know what good looks like or assumes we have the solution and we just need to figure out how to get there. Whereas the reframed question sort of challenges that assumption. It asks us to step back and interrogate like what we're actually trying to solve. So let's double click into the first one around AI ethics. So, a question people often ask, we hear a lot is like, well, how do we ensure AI is being used ethically? Well, what is assumed in this question is that we all agree on what ethical means, and we just need an implementation strategy for it. So, if you reframe, how do you ensure AI is used ethically to who gets to define ethical AI and whose values are embedded in those systems, you get an entirely different set of solutions. Um, yeah, here we go. Thank you. So the broader question on the left, right, actually it might be different on your screen. So I'll just say under the reframed question, gets at what those different solutions are. So instead of just compliance frameworks, we now have added to our exploration, like what do participatory design processes look like, community governance models, alternative accountability structures, things that we find are elevating more diverse voices and getting to define what ethical means, including with communities that are most affected by these algorithmic systems. So all of a sudden, we're asking questions not just about compliance, but about power. So who sits at these tables when these definitions get made? So for example, a venture capitalist in Boston and an organizer in rural Kentucky are going to have very different definitions of ethical AI. And so the reframe question surfaces this tension instead of papering over it, and it also just invites more voices to the table. And so the other thing I wanted to call out on this slide too is like what we report back to the field sort of changes dramatically. So instead of a more output oriented, which again is needed, question which around the how we ensure AI is being used ethically question. This right and left is really throwing me. We instead, if we open up and broaden the question and really focus on delivering the learnings back to the field, we might say something like, we've learned that communities prioritize transparency and auditability over efficiency. And that actually challenges how most AI ethics frameworks are designed. Like that's a more systemic insight that might be useful for the field in a way that's not just reporting back on a programmatic outcome. It's much beyond a single program. All right, let's do another example. All right, this one, again, taken from the Siegel canon is, about youth employment. So our original question, how do we increase job placement rates for disconnected youth? I think the assumption embedded in there is that young people lack like skills, trainings, and connections to achieve those jobs. And so we focus on those things that are going to help them achieve those jobs. And the metrics here are sort of like, did we place them in jobs? Is there a 90-day retention rate? Like, again, all super important things that we fund, things that we do. But if we were to reframe the question more broadly, would systemic barriers prevent young people from accessing economic opportunity, and what would it take to eliminate them? The whole shift focuses from fixing young people to fixing the broken system. And maybe isn't the problem isn't that the youth need the resume workshop. It's the problem is that the employers use credentials requirements in way that screen out talent. And so we found that in this one in particular, like the reframed question has become a lot more faithful to what the community's priorities are. Families, don't just want job placements; they want pathways to economic stability and dignity. Placements rates are sort of a proxy for that goal, but that's like not really what it's about at the end of the day. So we're trying to ask questions about, what folks are seeing on the ground, what are the patterns that they're seeing, and also working with families and youth in the organizations to set the agenda. So we're searching for the answers to this question together. And again, going back to the power shifting, this sort of like naturally shift power because the proximity to the barrier makes those communities more expert rather than us. And so we're trying to rebalance, although we can never fully get rid of, but like rebalance the power dynamic between us and the communities we serve. All right, so what is actually in the white paper? I'm going to turn you over to Kyle and Amanda in a second, but let me just give you a high-level overview of what's actually in the white paper. So science of questions, Stefan and our colleague Hannah will provide an overview of the science behind question formulation, much like the presentation you just saw. So it's really the theoretical grounding for why we're taking this approach. Section 2 is the case for questions in philanthropy. It has benefits and real world examples about what this has unlocked for us, or what asking different questions has unlocked for us. Section 3 is really a deep dive into our practice. It's an overview across the full cycle of grant making, how this actually works from sourcing through learning and sharing. I also want to acknowledge that we address the risks head on. What about standardized metrics? How do you avoid asking the wrong questions? Like all of that and more, just trying to fully open up the hood and let people know what we're learning and what we're wrestling with. Section 4 is more about movement building. So how does this fit into the broader science of questions work happening with folks like Stefan and across the field? And also just reviewing some of the field infrastructure that would be needed to build this out. So communities of practice, new evaluation frameworks, question accountability, those sorts of things. And then finally, you can see there's inquiry-driven grant making resources. These are one-page role guides for different roles at foundations from program officers up through board members. We're just trying to recognize that everyone has a very different need when it comes to incorporating questions into your work. And so they're meant to be very tactical and strategic and cultural all at the same time. So they kind of address multiple levels at each role, as well as actions you can take. And so, our invitation to folks here is just to take these, adapt them, share them with colleagues. You can jump into what's useful. You can read the whole paper, just kind of at your take. I think both options are available on the website. And so we covered the why, what inquiry unlocks for us and why we feel like it matters. And so now it's time for the how. So you can go to next slide. Because again, the goal isn't just different answers to the same questions, it's to put us on different trajectories entirely. And that requires like the mechanics. It requires those frameworks, those tools, those processes, and the orientation to make this happen. So I'm going to turn it over to Kyla and Amanda. They co-lead our knowledge and impact team, and they have spent years developing and refining these practices. They're going to walk you through exactly how inquiry shows up in our practice. So over to you both.
Thanks, Laura. I'm Amanda Ahern, Senior Research Associate for Knowledge and Impact, and we're so excited to share more about how this all works in practice. I'm joined by my colleague, as mentioned, Kyla, who can give us a bit of a primer.
Awesome. Thanks, Amanda. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here with us today. We're so excited to be sharing this work with you all finally. As we've said, it's many, many years in the making, so it's great to finally be chatting about it. I'm Kyla Kasharian. I'm the Senior Program Associate for Knowledge and Impact here at Siegel. So Amanda and I, as Laura mentioned, co-lead our Knowledge and Impact team. So we sort of sit in between our grants, our research, and our external engagement teams to facilitate our learning and to activate this inquiry-driven approach. So this is sort of our bread and butter. So we're really excited to share it. So we started off with Stefan grounding us in the emerging science of questions, and then Laura gave us a really great overview of our philosophical backing of why we're doing this work. So in this section, we'll dive into this question of what does this look like in practice and what can it look like in practice? And we'll talk about our daily practice, what it looks like across roles, and what it looks like across the lifespan of projects. And before I dive in, I do want to give the caveat that looking at the chat, I see that a lot of the folks here are actually not from philanthropy, they're from the nonprofit side, which is awesome. The great thing about all of this is that it maps really well over to nonprofit work and how you interact with constituents, and how you may interact with funders. So I'll try to call out both of those throughout. But before we get into the tools and tactics, I want to name something that doesn't always come up in these conversations, which is that inquiry is first a cultural commitment. And what I mean by that is that this is a commitment to reframing the way that we all work together, and that is centering curiosity over certainty. And it means making it culturally safe, and acceptable for people to say, I don't know, both within our own organizations and without. I think that's something that is challenging sometimes for philanthropy, because of the power dynamics that exist. We often, hold our grantees to really high standards, and we expect them to have answers. But we need to open ourselves up and be vulnerable and allow those answers to be yet to be determined. But it's true too on the philanthropy side. We often hold ourselves to the standard that we need to know, and we need to have a definitive answer. And what does it look like to be more vulnerable, and address these big, messy, complex problems by allowing ourselves to be a little bit more messy and complex in the way that we do the work. But Amanda can explain a little bit more about what this will look like in a real cycle.
Yeah, so here we're talking through how this maps onto the grant cycle from a funder perspective, but the same logic also applies if you're on the other side of the table too, as a nonprofit. So at every stage, you're really making decisions about what questions to bring to your program design, to your evaluation, to the conversation with your funder about what you're actually trying to learn. So at the strategy stage, the shift is starting with what don't we know rather than here's what we're going to do. So each portfolio or work stream for us is anchored to a big picture question, one that's genuinely open, refined through input from staff, partners, research, etc. So when you're sourcing or building relationships, the inquiry shift here is to ask partners what they're curious about before pitching your own priorities. And that one move, we feel like kind of shifts the power dynamic in the room. And so at the proposal or the project design stage, this really means co-developing a learning agenda rather than just handing them down, and making sure that our assumptions, as Laura was saying, are explicit, so they can actually be tested. And then during active engagement, it isn't just about what metrics we're hitting. It's really hinging, the quality of learning is hinging on whether the questions are being pursued are still the right ones. And when the question shifts mid project, which happens, that we're documenting what caused that shift, because that's really for us the data. And then finally, when we're sharing it out, like as Kyla said, we're working with external engagement to publish the questions that drove the work and not just the answers themselves, kind of and also like sometimes getting into like the messy middle. And I think that's how we're really poised to contribute to the field rather than just like reporting on our own efforts.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that I want to be clear about, is that this isn't just programs and strategy work. You saw on that last slide that every step of that process has a part of it that is inquiry driven, and that means that different people handle every part of that process. So while programs and strategy folks have a huge part to play, it goes far beyond that. So starting first with ops and grants management, I think this is one of my most favorite parts to talk about, because I see grants management folks as being the architects of the infrastructure that allows this process to work. So when you're designing your grants management system or your CRM, you can build out different fields that enable this sort of work, and it's low cost and pretty easy, but it unlocks a lot, allowing grants or funding streams to be tagged by inquiry area rather than just by program area or by funding type, or having a field in the reports that asks what surprised you this period, or what are some questions that are emerging from your work. Unlocks that ability to aggregate that data and start thinking in an inquiry driven way, beyond just traditional uses of those systems. You can also edit your timelines to allow more room for reflection, which for us is super valuable. And then also in the process reviews, start probing and ask, what is this actually for? What are we actually learning from this? Are we doing this just because, or is there actually a purpose behind it? Gets us towards that rigor that we were talking about. But to shift into on the next slide, what actually looks like for program staff, because this is a lot of the bread and butter. So much of this work is really relational, and program staff, both at foundations and at nonprofits, are the ones that are interfacing most directly with constituents or grantees, just the people that we're trying to reach most. So leveraging that relationality of the work is really important here. So opening your sourcing calls with, what are you curious about right now, instead of how are you fixing this problem that we all know exists. Consider your knowledge gaps and try to fill those. Take it humbly and know that we're not the experts in what we're doing. So lead with curiosity. And list out your assumptions for those questions. We don't always know best, and we are trying to learn as equitably and as well informed as we possibly can. So listing out those assumptions ahead of time helps us build out better grants, at least in our perspectives. And knowing that when a question shifts mid-grant, that doesn't mean it's a failure of your grant or your funding stream or your program or whatever. That's key learning data. And it means that it was a success because now we know better and we know differently and we can move on. It's not a problem to manage. And I think that's a reorientation that's super useful.
So for those in learning evaluation or knowledge management roles, the ask here might be a little uncomfortable, but it's really to map the current metrics against the questions that they're supposed to answer and being like really honest about the gaps. For us, we're applying this like what, so what, now what kind of framework to it as a synthesis mechanism that some of you may also be using. But it's really about like what are we learning, and what are we doing with those learnings, and like how can we iterate both internally and like what can we share out with the field, like what are we going to do with this going forward with all this information. So in terms of leadership, their job in the inquiry-driven culture is specific and really crucial, and we don't think can be delegated because it's really giving people explicit permission to say that the question has shifted, and not reading that as a failure. And then creating this space for productive failures. So basically, like efforts that maybe didn't go as planned, but generated real insight. And we often find the most powerful learnings like at that inflection point. And then regularly asking, like, what are we not asking that we should be? And that question tends to be really generative, almost more than any other.
Yeah, so to dive into our methodology, and again, I'll give the caveat that the way that we do things isn't the way that anybody has to do things. There's so many different ways to do this work. But we've been tackling this through a couple of different ways. One, if you look at our website, you'll see all of our portfolio level questions. Each of our sub-portfolio areas has a question and a hypothesis that we have with it. And we bucket all of those under conditions, incentives, and evidence, which is a framework that we built out based off of the learnings that we got from our grantees in previous years. So it's a really iterative practice. And as Amanda noted, we use this what, so what, now what framework to process the insights that we're getting in those learnings and to just make sense of them. Again, we haven't invented any of this. We're just pulling on different resources that have worked throughout the field. We take our sourcing questions and our check-in questions, and we intentionally make them more directed towards learning rather than just get to know you sort of stuff. We find that you can get to know folks even more if you're asking what questions they're asking. We try to value qualitative and quantitative evidence equally, especially knowing the capacity strengths that come with quantitative evidence. There's so much that can be learned from qualitative work. And all in all, we try to value iteration over success. Generally speaking, we know that change is part of this work and that we're never married to any individual solution, just an outcome that we're all on the same page about. So one last thing that I'll say that I think has been really exciting for this work, you'll see here that it's me and Amanda representing our knowledge and impact team, but we also have Flora and Ellery behind the scenes on our external engagement team, because so much of this needs to be linked to narrative infrastructure. As we're learning, we're not learning in a vacuum. We need to be in genuine dialogue with the field, both in sharing our insights out, but also making sure that we're getting insights in of all of the great work that folks that are in our fields are doing. So creating that linkage has been really exciting to unlock what an even larger level of a field of questioning and a field of inquiry within philanthropy could look like.
So pulling back the hood even a little further, this is what it looks like kind of on the day to day here at Siegel. So every portfolio begins with a systems level question that is sourced from staff and refined through a landscape review and not handed down from leadership. And so proposals, our learning agendas, our measurement plans, those are all built collaboratively with partners and again, not handed to them. For us, renewal isn't contingent on hitting traditional activity metrics or outcome metrics. It's really hinging on, whether meaningful learning is happening and whether the questions are being pursued are still the right ones. So for our check-ins, we try to lead with curiosity, asking, what are you most curious about right now? And that comes before, are you on track? And we recognize that this is easier to say as a funder than to live as a grantee. And so part of what we're trying to model is what it looks like when a funder creates genuine permission for learning over compliance. And we think that nonprofits can make the same ask of their funders explicitly as part of how they're framing their work. But the ask has to go in both directions for any of this to actually function.
Yeah, and I know Laura already walked us through some really tangible examples with questions, but I guess I'll give you a little bit more of an example of what this looks like in practice and in community with our partners. So, as many of you have probably seen on our LinkedIn or our website, we've been embarking on a rural strategic initiative, which has been really lovely. And we've been doing these consultations with folks within our portfolio and experts in the field and all sorts of people. Um, Thinking about tech in rural and what rural innovation looks like. And from what we heard from our conversations with folks in that space, the question that's mostly asked by funders has been, how are you using AI to increase rural innovation? And that sort of assumes that rural communities are already behind and that they need to catch up on the innovation front and that they don't know what they're doing. Instead, based off of what we heard, we were asking, how are tech narratives shaped in rural communities and what are the impacts? And how do technology and digital spaces impact your work in your communities? Um, and we uncovered totally different things. Found that participants were super excited to talk about AI and to share projects that were already happening. They're not terribly behind. There's so many different resources that are happening and accessible within rural communities, and so much progress that's already being made. And it totally changed our perspective on rural narrative. And armed with that shared question, we found so much community, and that's launched into a community of practice. And we're now thinking about how foundations can reframe their approach to technology and rurality. So, without having a predetermined output and leading with questions, we're able to uncover so much more towards our strategy and towards community building generally.
So here we want to be honest about the tensions that exist in this inquiry-driven approach. So emphasizing learning and questions over traditional metrics, as I said before, could be a little uncomfortable, and it does raise some challenges around measurability and comparability over time. So it requires rigor in how learning is structured and documented, not as a replacement for accountability, but as a form of it. And it requires ongoing alignment on shared questions so that insights stay actionable and cumulative rather than diffuse. So the value proposition here is also, we think, really significant. It elevates the expertise of the people closest to the problem, like Laura kind of outlined before, and it produces contextual understanding that surface level metrics might miss. It reframes failure as a source of learning rather than something to manage or hide. And over time, we think it builds genuine adaptability, which really matters a lot in a complex, adaptive, evolving system that we're all kind of working in.
We will close out before we head into Q&A with just an overview of the toolkit that we've built out. Laura already talked you through what to expect from the white paper and what to expect from the one-pagers. But a lot of that, I think, can feel a bit daunting of like, oh, I need to change my whole process and whole system. But it doesn't have to be like that. We can make small changes in the interim. So I wanted to just give you 3 questions right now that you can use in the coming week to just sort of start reorienting your thinking process. So in your next funder meeting, your grantee meeting, ask, what are you most curious about right now? On your next team meeting, ask, what are we not asking that we should be? Or when you're reviewing your data, ask, did this report help us learn anything? These and others are easy ways to start integrating inquiry into your daily practice.
Great. And with that, we have a couple of minutes left for Q&A. We received a couple of questions during sign up, which we bucketed into a few major themes. So I'm going to try to run through these in the remaining, 8 or so minutes we have left. So the first is, I'm going to direct this one to Kyla and Amanda, but how do you balance this open-ended, inquiry-driven questioning with the need for clear, measurable outcomes in grant making? I'm also going to, if you have time, to touch on a question that we got from the chat, which is, what internal tools do we use to track things?
Yes, absolutely. Can hit on both. First, I'll hit on the first one. This is tough, and it's a question that we get a lot, and it's really valid because the ambiguity of this approach does sort of necessitate a bit of flexibility with metrics. But I think the most useful solution that we've come across in this context is that collaborative and bespoke metric setting that we were talking about. As part of our learning agendas, we do set goals. This isn't entirely open-ended. We do ask, how would we know if we've learned this? Or what evidence do we need to answer this question? Or what does success look like? And that looks different for each of our grants. And we do set those goals. Amanda, I wanted to see if you wanted to jump in and add.
Yeah. So the questions that Kyla just mentioned are benchmarks and metrics we think in their own form that can guide the work and give us a structure to point to. So it's less traditional, like you need to serve XYZ amount of people. But we still think it's still rigorous and we find that it's reportable to a board. And like Laura said, for this work can be scaffolded on top of your existing work. So maybe your board or your funders required standard metrics and reporting, and that's really not an issue for us. So we just add inquiry into the qualitative parts of your work, and then we add like a new layer of analysis to those already existing metrics, and we think that they could be complements to one another.
Totally. And on the tools part, I think that this can be integrated into any sort of tech stack. I don't think that ours is particularly unique, but we use giving data as our grant management system, and that allows us to get information directly from the grantees, which is where we aggregate all of their learnings. We also use Google Suite, which helps us track all of this information and get info from our grants managers. And we've recently been experimenting more with AI, particularly Notebook LM, to help us generate insights and put them into ways that are, or formats that are more digestible for our team. And lastly, Atlas TI has been helpful for deductive and inductive coding of written check-ins. But again, there's so many different ways that you can do this that are like high tech, low tech. That's not necessary to make this work.
Great, thanks. And then I'm going to ask this next question to Stefan, which is, what are some ways to develop these approaches with emerging leaders? Or what would you tell folks who are emerging leaders about the science of questions?
Great. Thanks so much, Laura. Well, I think anyway, Kyla, and I don't have much to add to what Kyla and Amanda already were mentioning, but I think it is important to take a step back and to really reflect on what are we questioning about. And so one of the key elements in order to define the question is to also define the field that needs questioning. And too often we basically start with an assumption that we actually know what the field looks like and that we have a clear understanding of what are the areas that we should prioritize. But taking a step back and what we call is kind of developing a gestalt of a field, right? So that you actually have an understanding of what are all the issues that implies when we talk about a particular problem. And then based upon that, having a set of criteria that are both external and internal to define on how would you then narrow that gestalt into kind of areas that requires prioritization that then also will steer formulation of the question that you seek to answer as well. And having that kind of topic mapping or gestalt also allows you to, what Kyla and Amanda was referring to, allows you to have a better understanding what is already known, what is not known, and what are some orphan issues that actually no one has addressed or no one has questioned to a large extent. And I think that's basically what I would argue is kind of a key step is to really build that kind of topic map, knowledge map, and then decide what area of the map is relevant for your work, should be prioritized, and then how do we go about formulating question that advances our understanding, advances our learning within that part of the map that has been prioritized for using a particular kind of rationale.
Thanks so much, Stefan. And then I'm gonna just take one last question, just because it touches on my work and Eller's work as part of external engagement. But just, good, philanthropy includes good storytelling. How does that interface with questions? And I think this is really important for the narrative infrastructure part that Kyla mentioned earlier in the call, which is I think that they complement each other really well. So we found that questions can generate much richer stories, and some of the most compelling stories within our portfolio emerged from somewhere unexpected. So when a grantee says, "We thought the problem was X, but it's actually Y," like that narrative is powerful because there was space to explore and because we're actually like course correcting in real time. I also think like some, traditional storytelling, like the way that we put pressure on it can sometimes feel performative. So, this program served, 500 youth, 85% got jobs. Like that's a really important data point. It's a really important finding. But what's more interesting about that for the learning of the field is like, well, we actually discovered credentialing requirements were screening out talent. So we work with employers to redesign hiring. Like that's a real story that we've told before. And I mean, both of those things are real things that we've told before. But the second tells you something about what we can learn from and how we can improve as a field, not just what happened. And so again, both have value, and good questions need good storytelling to really get the insights out there. And so thank you all so much for being here. With that, we only have a few minutes left. I just wanted to give an invitation to our next steps. If this is interesting to you, would love to help build this field together. So take what's useful, adapt what isn't. If you've met one foundation, you met one foundation. So the reason that we have created the paper the way that we did was to give tons of room for folks to find what's going to work for you, what's going to work for your context. But one of the things that we do ask is that you share back with us what you're learning so that we can continue to build this field together. And speaking of field, we're delighted to announce that we will more formally be launching some field infrastructure in the form of a center at NYU that will focus on the science of inquiry. Stefan, can I pass it to you to explain more?
Yes, thanks so much. And so, so excited to disclose that together with Siegel, we are launching QLab because we came to the realization that there is no dedicated place that seeks to answer questions about questions. And so what we hope to do with QLab is to really build this kind of new science of inquiry. I mean, we were very rushed today to go through all the important slides that we wanted to share. But what we hope to do with QLab is to really take a step back and say, anyway, what is the role of questions? But then more importantly, how do we start developing better questions as a society, as a sector, but also how do we create questions fluency, making sure that it's not just a theoretical exercise, but also an exercise that creates a new methodology, creates a new fluency among change makers that really need to start formulating questions in new ways. And also what we hope to do is then test out the methodology in real practice. And some of you know that for the last few years, we already had an initiative called the 100 Questions Initiative, where we try to identify what are some questions that matter. And so we hope to do this with QLab moving forward as well. Anyway, if you are interested in staying involved, please let us know. We have this form here that we have created in order to also understand whether you would be interested in being part of QLab, but also an indication on what kind of QLab deliverables would you be interested in and should we prioritize as well.
Thank you. Again, we're so excited to launch this with you. Thank you for being such a great thought partner and partner in building up this new field. So with that, we are going to close out. As a reminder, everyone on the call, as well as our broader network, will receive a link to our website with the paper, as well as a recording and any other materials that we've shared here today. So thank you all so much for being here. We're really excited for what's next.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.